All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what this step, of course, means, we're being joined by Mr. Greg Swenson, who's the chairman, Republicans Overseas UK, and a political analyst is, of course, joining us live from London. Mr. Swenson, this, of course, is going to be a very interesting move on the part of the Americans at this stage of the war, where it's now being talked about that the limitation that had been imposed on Ukraine in not being allowed to fire the long-range Storm Shadow missiles could be lifted, and Ukraine would be allowed to strike targets deep inside Russia. What do you think will be the impact of this? Will it be substantial, or will it not have any impact whatsoever?
Well, I think there might be some tactical advantages to being able to do that, notably to cut off Russian supply lines and Russian energy sources. And that's something that the Russians have been doing to the Ukrainians from the beginning of this war. So it kind of points to the, I think, finally, maybe capitulation by the U.S. specifically, but also the U.K., but especially the U.S., because it's been so inconsistent. It's been very gradual in terms of, going back to February of 2022. It's been a very incremental supply chain from the U.S. In other words, they started with very basic supplies, military supplies, some lethal supplies, but not all that the Ukrainians requested. And then, finally did Abrams tanks. Then they did F-16s. It's been a very gradual process. Now, perhaps that's because President Biden was afraid of escalating with Putin. But this incrementalism, it just shows that there's no consistency. It's just an incoherent strategy. There's been no real end game developed by the administration. But I think it's a good move tactically for the Ukrainians to be able to do that.
Right. It's interesting that you've described this strategy on the part of the Americans as incoherent, because earlier in the month of April, the Americans had sanctioned the use of the ATACMS long-range missile, which seems to have had very little impact, so to speak, on the ground. And recently, Lloyd Austin went on record to state that there is no silver bullet that will turn the tide of the war, and not one single weapon system can actually make a serious impact on what is unfolding at this moment between Russia and Ukraine. So what impact do you think these Storm Shadow missiles will actually have in the way this war is progressing?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure it'll break the stalemate, but I do think that the Ukrainians were at a great disadvantage because they're being outmanned and outarmed by the Russians, and now you see the Russians buying weapons from the Iranians. They've been buying from several sources. So I think it's kind of it's not a level playing field, basically, and I think that's been a great difficulty. It's made it much more difficult for the Ukrainians, who have been very brave, and they've made great sacrifices. So it only makes sense to either not arm them at all or arm them so that they can actually win, or at least make an effort at pushing back against the Russians.
And also, President Joe Biden in the United States is on his way out. We do not know who will be in charge at the White House in a few months from now. So is this a sort of a make or break strategy that the current American administration is resorting to?
Yeah, I think to a certain degree, but again, it's been going on for 2.5 years. So, this is kind of maybe, too little too late. If they had done this at the beginning, the Ukrainians would have been in a much better position, but they were always playing defense. And this might enable the Ukrainians, again, to strike inside Russian territory, not to bomb civilians, not to kill civilians like the Russians are doing, but to be to use tactical strikes against energy and other supplies. So I think it's sensible. It's been incremental. So as usual, it's probably 6 months too late, or perhaps even 36 months too late.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Greg Swenson, for joining us and getting us that perspective.
Thank you.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.